Mthokozisi saying,
We can
are
start.
we ready to go? Okay. Commissioner Mantlana, over to you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session that's called Carbon Budgets, Fair Shares and Sequestration Uncertainty. Today we're going to be dealing with a very complex topic, so we are grateful that you could join us. As you know, as we navigate the complexities of global and local climate action, today we're going to discuss three critical questions. The first one is how global carbon budgets work. Secondly, we're going to be thinking about countries' responsibilities and ambition. And then we're going to be considering the extent to which land-based CO2 fluxes are a part of the carbon budgets. And then lastly, we're going to look at which technologies actively remove and capture CO2. So our discussions are going to be around those issues. We are grateful to the group of experts that have joined us today, and thank you for your time. We look forward to a rich and engaging discussion. We request that you submit your questions and comments for Q&A session. Perhaps you can already start doing that now as the session goes on and not wait until the end. Just a note about the significance of climate change. My view is that addressing climate change has never been more important than today. And we know that we are experiencing a situation of shrinking global carbon budgets. And the shrinking carbon budgets go together with the escalation of climate impacts, which we are seeing across the world. Related to that, we know that the world is not on track to achieve the desired 1.5-degree goal. So all of this makes this conversation very relevant. Domestically, we are putting together our NDC as South Africa. You will recall that the first one was submitted in 2016 and it was updated in 2021. The first NDC covered the years 2025 to 2030, and the second NDC will cover 2030 to 2035. I'm sure to all of the people here, this is a well-known fact. The Presidential Climate Commission has a vested interest in supporting the development and the enhancement of South Africa's NDC. These NDCs are at the heart of our country's climate commitments under the Paris Agreement. They reflect the country's GHG emissions ambition. At the same time, the intention is that they also ensure social and economic resilience. All of this building pathways towards a just transition. So colleagues, today, we are inviting you to talk with us about these issues that are directly related to the mission of the Presidential Commission, which is just transition. So let's get going. Our first speaker today is Professor Pedro Monteiro. Pedro is a professor at University of Stellenbosch School for Climate Studies. He leads the work of carbon dioxide removal research and is and focusing on global and regional science and governance for net zero emissions. Pedro, I hand over to you, please. From my side, I can't hear you, Pedro.
Okay. Sorry. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So first of all, thanks very much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's really an important one, and I hope that this is something that will also grow, and that this collaboration will continue because this is certainly something which will take quite a while to finalize. So I'm focusing on the global remaining carbon budgets and their uncertainties. This is work which has sort of really progressed since it started at AR5 more than 10 years ago. And at that point, the idea that achieving net zero was a requirement to stabilize warming and climate change really sort of emerged and gave rise to the need for the calculation of a remaining carbon budget around particular targets. There are many carbon budgets, and very often when we talk about global carbon budgets, we mean the budgets of the sources and sinks from terrestrial, ocean, atmosphere, as well as the inventories. This is not what I'm talking about today. Today, I'm really talking about what is the amount of, how do we actually go about calculating the amount of emissions, carbon and non-CO2 emissions, so that we are able to achieve particular temperature targets, the main ones being the ones that are set by the Paris Agreement of 2 degrees with an ambition towards 1.5 degrees. So these are the kind of 4 questions that I really would like to explore in my talk today. And they really deal with the different aspects of what is the remaining carbon budget, as well as how does the carbon science community approach the rigor, what's the rigor that the global carbon science community uses to address the questions of uncertainty. So, cutting to the chase, this field is also an area where definitions are really critical. And this is something which is really important, particularly when different numbers are being created using different assumptions. So the definitions that underlie each of the methods are really critical to understand and enunciate. So I'm starting off, sorry, I've got a helicopter outside the window, so just excuse me for a second. Oh, sorry. Thanks. So the general definition is that the remaining carbon budget is the amount of CO2 emitted until we reach global net zero CO2, i.e. it stops warming, i.e. delta T equals 0. Since the Paris Agreement, temperature targets have been set, which have provided a degree of specificity. I linked those to the net zero to temperature thresholds. So this is the amount of, so it becomes the amount of CO2 that can be emitted and still remain under a particular goal of surface air temperature, global surface air temperature. Before we go any further, in this talk, I'm referring to the units of, the budget units that I'm using are gigatons of CO2, not gigatons of carbon. And that gigatons of CO2 is more widely used in the policy community, whereas gigatons of carbon is more widely used in the science community. So just at the bottom there is the relationship between the two. In the table is one of the most recent assessments of what is the remaining carbon budget for different temperature targets, 1.5, 1.7, 2 degrees centigrade, and with each one with a probability, quantile probability for each one of them. So 50%, 66%, and 83%. And those numbers there are what the remaining carbon budget are to achieve those temperature thresholds for particular probabilities of achieving them. So one of the interesting things that one can see there is that, in fact, we have already passed the budget for an 83% chance of staying under 1.5 degrees centigrade. So these numbers were from 2 years ago. So you have to add 2 years of emissions, which would be 80 gigatons. So that's really 70 to 80. So that really gives you a sense of how we are progressing. Rapidly, we are progressing, particularly around the 1.5 degrees. The core, the backbone of the remaining carbon budget is the sort of rather arcanely named transient climate response to cumulative CO2 emissions, or TCRE as it's most widely named. And this is a quasi-linear, a ratio of temperature to cumulative CO2 emissions, which turns out to be quasi-linear. It's an extraordinary metric because it actually is able to turn the complexity of process scales and feedbacks, which drive enormous degrees of spatial and temporal variability in the Earth system. And we are able to, in a sense, collapse that into a relationship that relates the driver of global warming with the metric of global warming temperature. So in the figure, there's the range that is sort of attributed to TCRE at the moment. And it's a number which is a degree centigrades per 1,000 gigatons of CO2 emitted. So the critical aspect here is that this relationship is quasi-linear, and it's actually also pathway independent. In other words, it doesn't matter whether you are in a high mitigation or low mitigation pathway, up to a very high CO2 emission level, it remains quasi-linear. So this is an example of, to really emphasize that point, which is that when you move from the observed part of the emissions trajectory, into the projections of the models, the same quasi-linear relationship holds, and that holds for the different emission pathways. So TCRE is a relationship which is actually strongly anchored in the geophysics. And although the geophysical understanding of it is not complete, it is very advanced. And here you can see what are some of the major drivers that help explain this quasi-linear relationship, which is the backbone for the estimation of the remaining carbon budget. So here you can see that the ocean plays a dominant role. And then there are a whole number of factors which, as the emissions increase, they more or less offset each other, so maintaining that linearity. So here's how the first step of the use of the calculation of the global remaining carbon budget works. So we have the same relationship of TCRE underpinning it that we saw earlier. We have to start with calculating a threshold of historic emissions. And of course, there's an uncertainty associated with that. And the global carbon community has gone significantly down the road of stabilizing that uncertainty by really using the last second half of the 19th century, the mean warming and as the basis from which to calculate the emissions. So then on the other end, we set the policy goal. For example, it could be 1.5, it could be 2 degrees. And from there, you calculate what is the cumulative anthropogenic emissions that correspond to that temperature threshold. And this in green is then the remaining carbon budget if TCRE was the only basis on which the relationship on which to calculate the remaining carbon budget. Of course, the world is not quite like that. And so the complexity that arises there is that the models are not, so if the models were able to capture all the processes that drive CO2 and non-CO2 emissions and the processes that modulate them, then there would be no need for additional quantification of contributors, additional contributors to the remaining carbon budget. But as it turns out, there are a number of variables, which are the ones in yellow in this. So this is the overall equation which determines the budget. And just quickly here, you've got the temperature threshold, the policy set temperature threshold. We've got the historic emissions. So theoretically, if TCRE was the only driver, these two terms would not be necessary. And so you divide that by TCRE to calculate a carbon budget, and you correct it for an additional term, all of which are defined here. So these three terms here, as well as to some lesser extent, the historic and recent emissions, these three terms here are the ones that are actually they've been the main focus of the efforts to constrain their contribution to the uncertainty. They are the zero emissions commitment, the Earth system feedbacks that are not quantified in models, and the warming from non-CO2 emissions, which are the result of socioeconomic activities such as mining and industry, which are not part of the Earth system model processes. So they have to be quantified separately. So looking at each one of them individually, the zero emission commitment is really the question, how much warming, if we stopped emitting CO2, how much warming beyond that point would actually happen? And this is a diagram that sort of illustrates that point, that one could possibly have warming, one could possibly have cooling, depending on what the mix of factors are. And this is the sort of the approximate estimate that is used at the moment, which is that zero emission commitment quantified by the IPCC and AR6, as well as the more recent ones, are centered on zero, with an uncertainty which was 0.3 and is now also 1.19. So roughly speaking, ZEC, the zero emission commitment, it contributes roughly 15% of total warming. These are some of the considerations that have to be taken into account in understanding and would have to be, so theoretically, if these were included explicitly in the Earth system models, there would be no need for this term to be included as a separate item. So here you can see the over a range of models from the Earth system models. Most are centered around zero, but 2 or 3 are actually on the extremes of showing a net cooling after 50 years, and some are showing a net warming after 50 years. And here you see that the differences in those models are in the way those models handle ocean heat and ocean CO2, as well as the land component. So these are some of the differences between the models that actually make it necessary to treat zero emission commitment as a separate item of a correction item. Then there's the non-CO2 warming. There's a component of non-CO2 gases in the atmosphere, which the Earth system models do, in fact, handle and simulate. But the ones that are associated with human activities are not included because the scales are not, the Earth system models are not able to integrate those scales into the processes that they handle. So they have to be handled separately by what's called the reduced complexity models. And this is an example here, which is really showing how the trajectory of warming associated with an emission scenario then responds if you treat the different contributions of CO2 and non-CO2 gases separately. So the blue line is what happens if you just stop CO2 emissions, but you leave the non-CO2 gases unmodified. And you can see that the aerosols which cool, which have a cooling effect, are offsetting the methane, nitrous oxide, and CFCs, which have a warming effect. So the net effect is a sort of a gradual warming here. If you stop the CO2 and aerosols, you can see the warming effect that the removal of the aerosols has, a very rapid one. And if you remove all greenhouse gases and aerosols, if you just zero the greenhouse gases, you have a rapid cooling. And if you just add aerosols to that, you can see that the compensating effect that it has in terms of warming that. So you can see the important role of the non-CO2 gases. So these are...
Pedro.
Yes?
Sorry, Pedro. You have about 3 minutes remaining.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so these are the models that are used to address that. So now what we have here are the corrections that need to be made to compensate for the zero emission commitment, the non-CO2 emissions, which then reduce the remaining carbon budget to a smaller level, and that is further reduced when you introduce the feedbacks that are unaccounted for in the models. So this yields a revised remaining carbon budget, which is the light green, from the original one, which is just based on the TCRE. This figure here really shows how for 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, how the changes that happen from the AR6 assessment for the 1.5 degrees in this case, which was close to 500 gigatons, and that's been revised to about half of that with emissions and the revision of the non-CO2 the models that provide the reduced complexity models that provide an assessment of the contribution from the non-CO2 emissions, providing most of the difference, the reduction in the remaining carbon budget. And this is just the same for the 2 degrees. For those who will take the slides, there's some background information which is accessible. So we want to now move from the science, global and regional, to introduce the concepts of how do concepts of justice and politics modulate the remaining carbon budget. And this is something that how we are moving to towards my former colleague, IPCC colleague, Professor Rogelj. And here you can see that whereas initially the remaining carbon budget can be formulated from initial choices, which are both policy and scientific, to as well as the scientific ones, which are climate science ones, which are the ones on the right-hand side. And from there, we move from a global carbon budget, remaining carbon budget, and how do we actually then turn that into a national or regional carbon budget. And this is where issues of historical responsibility, fairness, equity come in, as well as a clear methodological choices. And so at this point, I'd like to then hand over to you, Dr. Matlana, and pass on to the next presentation.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you for focusing on what exactly are we going to be talking about today. Now we move to Joeri. As Pedro has said, Joeri is author of the 5th and 6th IPCC assessments. He's a professor at Imperial College in London and is the director of research at the Grantham Institute. His input is going to focus on the case study and on the fairness and ambition of carbon budgets. Joeri, please come in.
Thank you very much. I hope my slides are visible. Good afternoon,
Yes.
and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this webinar informing South Africa's climate strategy. Fairness and ambition are two pillars of climate action, and not in the least because they are explicitly referred to under the Paris Agreement. It's a privilege to be able to contribute some thoughts on these issues. In this presentation, I will be drawing on insights and lessons learned from work that was carried out by the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change. And it really provides a bridge between the concept of a global carbon budget aligned with a specific temperature limit, the technicalities and science of which my colleague Pedro Monteiro very exhaustively showed, and then national action. And I hope this can inform how the questions of ambitions and fairness can be approached at the national level in a constructive and also operational way. So first, a bit of context about the case study that I would like to discuss. The case study of setting an ambitious and fair climate target for the EU. Here on the left, you see the title page of the 2021 European Climate Law. This law establishes that the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change should advise the EU on a 2040 target that is needed for an irreversible transition towards meeting the EU's mid-century net zero greenhouse gas target. And it also states that these goals should be achieved in a just, socially balanced, fair and cost-effective manner, based on the best available science and in pursuit of the global goals of the Paris Agreement. What are these goals of the Paris Agreement here? We have Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, which provides us with the long-term temperature goal of holding warming well below 2 degrees while pursuing to limit it to 1.5, and with later decisions emphasizing a focus on 1.5. Article 2 of the Paris Agreement also provides us with the overarching context and acknowledgement that the agreement will be implemented to reflect equity. And besides that, we have Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, which provides further clarification on mitigation, indicating that global greenhouse gas emissions should peak, decline, and reach net zero levels as soon as possible. And also that countries should submit and pursue nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. To this end, each NDC will have to represent three things: a progression compared to the previous NDC, a country's highest possible ambition, quote unquote, and an equitable contribution, implying that countries that are more developed should take the lead. So to put this onto one page, what is the ask for the science-based advice that was requested? Advice on a 2040 target in line with the Paris Agreement and that represents highest possible ambition, is socially just, balanced, and fair, is considered in the context of sustainable development, and is cost-effective and feasible. That's no small ask, so let me show you how we got on with this. We answered this question with the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change. In short, the advisory board is an independent body providing the EU with scientific knowledge, expertise, and advice relating to climate change. It was established by the 2021 European Climate Law and consists of 15 independent scientific experts. Here you can see them. They were appointed in March 2022 with a mandate of 4 years, 15 experts, 11 different nationalities. All these members are appointed in personal capacity and independent from their member states or from EU institutions or even their home institutions. And their expertise covers a wide range of sectors, both in climate change mitigation and adaptation. We have economists, engineers, agronomists, and also, for example, one leading legal scholar. That should be enough for the introduction. So let's have a look at the advice. The board published 2 advisory documents. A first early advice published in early 2023, shown here on the left, when we did not have a corporate identity yet, describing the framework and the general approach that the board considered to be most appropriate. And then a second advice that was published in June 2023, where this approach was then applied with a quantitative target advice as the result. In this presentation, I will focus more on the approach and the considerations than the actual numbers, because it is really this approach that will be most relevant and maybe also transferable to the South African context. The board first advised on an approach that takes into account 4 important aspects. You can see them here on this slide with the 4 elements going from the top left to the bottom right. The first is that we should consider the legal context. And this is, in our case, the EU commitments under the European Climate Law, the International Paris Agreement, and other relevant legal acts. We should also include a key understanding of the limits to emissions. This refers to the global carbon budget that we discussed in the previous presentation, but equally so, how this is translated to the country level with different perspectives regarding the EU's fair share of emissions. The third aspect is then a quantification of feasible emission reduction pathways, a techno-economical analysis. And then the last aspect that we consider is the assessment of the implications of these pathways, the side effects and the co-benefits. From the start, however, it was clear to the advisory board that providing relevant scientific advice requires choices to be made. Choices about the interpretation of the global climate target, about the global carbon budget, about how it is translated to national shares, and about how deeply emissions can be reduced domestically, or about which side effects should be avoided. These choices are not scientific. These are societal choices and represent value judgments. So this acknowledgement is a central part of the approach of the Scientific Advisory Board and ended up to be both empowering and essential. Basically, by rooting any value judgment that was required to carry out the analysis not in our own opinions, but in values expressed in EU legislation, we were able to maintain scientific rigor while providing relevant policy advice. Just to give you an idea what this kind of legal context and value judgments mean, I can't go through all these examples, but we'll want to give you a sense of what this means. Some of those principles provide guidance on the need for climate action on the left, while others provide guidance on how choices can make when certain alternatives are available. So an example of the former is the principle of human dignity and human rights, which underpins the need to act on climate change and avoid the impacts. An example of the latter, where principles inform choices, is the explicit mention in EU treaties of the precautionary principle, the polluter pays principle, or the do no significant harm principle. In the South African context, one could equally look at principles expressed in foundational legislation and treaties. They might be similar, they might be overlapping, but they probably won't be exactly the same. So equipped with this normative guidance, we could then tackle the issue of advising on a fair and ambitious EU 2040 target. And this slide shows the general approach followed for the advice. At the top, you can see physical limits. And this is basically that based on the international commitments, we look at the EU contribution in the context of a global goal of limiting warming to 1.5. Under this overarching global ambition, there are two pillars. At the left, we look at the latest available techno-economical pathways and consider their feasibility, their synergies with sustainable development, and their side effects. At the right, we consider what the EU's fair share of the global carbon budget is, and then we merge these insights at the end. So let's look at both of these pillars in turn. We start with the quantification and information that informs the EU's fair share. So estimating the EU's fair share of the carbon budget has legal, ethical, and practical dimensions. And these dimensions should be transparently structured and communicated. This visual shows how any quantification of fair shares starts from a set of equity or fairness principles. For example, the principle of equality, the principle of sustainable development, the principle of the polluter pays principles, or the ability to pay principle, or the beneficiary pays principle. In the slide deck that I shared, I have included an additional slide with short description of each of these terms for your reference, but I don't have time to discuss each of those in detail here. For the concept, it also doesn't necessarily matter. But operationalizing these overarching fairness principles, we then have a layer of allocation approaches, which are shown in green here. These are basically conceptual ways of apportioning a global carbon budget to individual countries. Each of these approaches is subsequently underpinned by measurable considerations and indicators, such as a country's GDP, a country's population, and so on. So let's have a look at how this was applied in the context of the EU's advice. Starting from a global carbon budget aligned with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees with 50% probability, we estimate the EU's fair share carbon budget from 2020 onwards. Just want to highlight that while these values here show the results from 2020 onwards, they take into account the historical emissions starting from pre-industrial as well. So let me quickly explain the figure on the right here. Each bar represents the quantification of a different interpretation of fairness for the remaining or the fair share of the EU carbon, for the EU of the carbon budget. Lighter and darker bars demonstrate the difference that a lenient versus a strict calculation interpretation of parameters can make when estimating these fair share. They also show different interpretations of fairness. For example, allocating fair shares based on responsibility for emissions since 1850, compared to a more recent 1990 date when the first assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was published. The leftmost bars, so the two largest ones, show an equal global per capita budget allocation and represent the starting point for the consideration of further principles, which are then included in the other bars on the right of it. So when we take into account the EU's historical responsibility, its greater capability to take climate action compared to other countries, the budget is reduced from this purely equality-based metric. So dividing a 1.5-degree aligned carbon budget according to different approaches to equity shows that in some cases the EU has already used its fair share of the global carbon budget. Translating these calculations to the South African context will require an equally diligent reflection on the fairness principles that are appropriate and applicable. And it could well be that under certain interpretations of the polluter pays principles, South Africa's remaining carbon budget could also be very small. Now, having looked at the fairness dimension of an EU contribution, we now turn our attention to what is feasible. To this end, the advisory board launched a call for evidence for techno-economical scenarios that could inform the potential for emission reductions in the EU. From the more than 1,000 scenarios that were collected, we first selected those that contained sufficient detail at the level of the EU and were consistent with the existing greenhouse gas objectives. This brought this massive number down to 63 scenarios, which were further refined by selecting scenarios that did not rely excessively on biomass, which would come with important biodiversity and other sustainability side effects, and accounted for limits to technological upscaling and behavioral change. Finally, we ended up with a small but relevant and useful selection of 7 scenarios that we then compared in terms of their relative environmental risks and challenges to their assumed technological deployment. Here we see the results of these deliberations. Considering 1.5-degree aligned scenarios with environmental risk levels within environmental risk levels resulted in emission reductions of 88 to 95% by 2040 relative to 1990, shown in orange on this slide here. Meanwhile, making more conservative assumptions regarding renewable energy scale-up leads to a slightly narrower range of 88 to 92. How is this information now combined with the assessment of fairness? The first row here shows the outcomes of the techno-economic analysis of feasibility reductions. We considered that minimizing environmental risks should remain a high priority, but that there are also possibilities to overcome some of the challenges related to technological scale-up. In a recommended feasible range based on feasibility considerations only of 88 to 95. However, if we compare the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions implied by these reductions with the budget that resulted from the fair share analysis, we see that all the considered feasible pathways exceed the equity-based fair share estimates. And this led the board's ultimate advice of a reduction that is pegged to the higher end of the feasible range. That means of at least 90%. The final recommendation was thus a range that combines considerations of feasibility and fairness. So let me make this in this last visual even clearer and show how everything fits together. These 2 bars shows the cumulative greenhouse gas emissions between 2020 and 2050 for the EU, implied by a 90 and 95% reduction path, respectively. We can compare this with the cumulative emissions of the equity-based fair share estimates. And it shows that despite already reducing by 90 and 95%, they are still higher than these fair share estimates that you show here on the right. Note that the top bar shown on the right here, the dark purple line there, represents already an overly generous allocation that only assumes the equality principle, but does not take into account yet the aspects of responsibility and capability. If we take those into account, you end up with the lower purple lines and therefore with a larger shortfall with the feasible pathways. So what is the recommendation here? First and foremost, this shortfall between what is feasible and what is fair can be reduced by achieving additional pre-2050 domestic mitigation. This can be done by aiming for the more ambitious end of the range or overachieving the 2030 target. In addition, it can also be complemented with a contribution to mitigation outside the EU. The board did not quantify or specify these contributions in much detail, but there are many opportunities in which countries can support others in achieving a higher ambition. And then finally, and only once the two earlier steps have been considered in line of increasing ambitions, the board also advises the EU to deliver net negative greenhouse gas emissions within the EU after 2050 to further reduce the difference between what is feasible and what is fair. And with that, I hope I've been able to provide you with some food for thought and one example of how the challenge of balancing what is feasible with what is fair can be approached. I hope that I was able to show the importance of transparently communicating value judgments and choices that underpin scientific analysis and the need for grounding these in broad societal evidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Joeri. That was very, very insightful. Thank you. Now we move on, colleagues. We move back to South Africa. We're going to have a focus now on land-based CO2 fluxes. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on what are these land-based CO2 fluxes, how are they determined, and what's the level of certainty of their scale. And that's going to be presented by Professor Sally Archibald, together with Mthokozisi Moyo. I understand Dr. Graham von Maltese is also part of the team that is available to answer questions at the end of their input. Professor Sally is based at University of Witwatersrand in the School of Animal and Plant and Environmental Sciences. He has extensive experience of working in savanna ecosystems. Mthokozisi is also at the same university at Wits, also at the same School of Animal, Plant and Environmental Sciences. I like their acronym, it's called APES. Mthokozisi is also a consultant at the C4 Eco-Solutions, where he has worked on various climate change mitigation projects. Sally, I hand over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Commissioner. It's lovely to be here. Let me just share my screen. I hope I can get this right. You're able to see my presentation?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so we were tasked by kind of giving a summary for the general populace about South Africa's terrestrial sequestration. Can you hear me better now? And then concentrating on the certainty and the uncertainty about this, because I think it's about making decisions based on our available knowledge and our certainty about these things. Just to sort of summarize, so as mentioned, this slide was put together with me, Mthokozisi, and also Graham von Maltese. And I just want to highlight that in South Africa, we have a lot of data. Like I work at the scale of Africa a lot, and we are sometimes data constrained. But it's very important for government and policy people to know about the amazing resources available within South Africa to quantify our carbon budget and to understand the consequences of trying to manipulate our terrestrial carbon budget. So there are various reports produced by DFFE, and we've also produced a regional assessment of the carbon budget. And we have really good mapping projects of soil and tree biomass within South Africa. Just to make sure we're all on the same page about what we actually mean by biological carbon, here's a little schematic on the left of an ecosystem, highlighting where the different components of the carbon budget are found. We have above ground woody biomass in the trees. We have above ground herbaceous biomass in the grasses and the forbs. We have a lot of below ground woody and herbaceous biomass. And then we have soil organic carbon, which is found at sort of different depths. And we can picture it better when we draw pictures, but what we tend to do when we're doing carbon cycle analysis is to think of it as a stock and flow diagram, where each component is a box. So you have your woody biomass now as a box. Some of it's above ground, some of it's below ground. And then these arrows are the fluxes. It's the carbon coming into the terrestrial land surface and the carbon going out of the terrestrial land surface. We include peat in these analyses, so like very, very carbon-rich soils, but we exclude coal. Coal is considered a fossil fuel and it's not counted for in the terrestrial budget. So when it comes to South Africa, an analysis of where the biocarbon is stored. Here's a little map of South Africa with our different biomes. We have a very large grassland biome, which is the green. Orange is savanna. We have some arid biomes, the karoo, the shrublands. We have the beautiful fynbos. And then somewhere in there, you can't really see it, we have little pockets of indigenous forest, these little black pockets. So if you sum up all the carbon that's found in these different biomes, you see that in the different biomes, pretty much a third of it's in the savanna, a third of it's in the grassland, and there's a very small amount of carbon in all the other biomes. Our forests have like less than 1% of our carbon because they cover such a small land area. So that's in terms of which parts of South Africa have the carbon. The largest amount of carbon is in the grasslands, and it's stored there as soil carbon. So in terms of which of those boxes have the last carbon, most of our carbon is in the soil as soil organic carbon. So 90% of the carbon in South Africa is actually below ground in the soil, stored as organic carbon mixed up with the soil layer. And then we have a very small tree biomass is only about 9% of the total biocarbon. Just to look at that spatially, you can see the above ground carbon is focused on places with high rainfall and where we have trees, so the little forested patches. So we have very small patches of high above ground carbon. But when it comes to the below ground carbon, we have much higher stores. Anywhere that has high rainfall and is a grassland has massive amounts of soil carbon. Even though some of our grasslands don't have, if they're arid, there's not a lot of carbon, but you can get up to really, really high numbers of soil carbon, 250 tons per hectare. Just to remind you that we shouldn't forget these peatlands because it's a unique carbon store, and we have some really good peatland mapping that's been done in recent years. Here's a picture of a peatland. You can see it's mostly like dead organic material. So that organic material is a very permanent stock. It's large quantities of carbon, but if you mismanage your peatlands, you can lose all of that carbon over a very short amount of time. Just to bring us back to this idea that grasslands have as much carbon as forests. I think it's often really hard when we're talking about managing the land surface, because the first thing people think about is let's go out and plant trees. So an ecosystem like this, that's a mixture of forests and grasslands, you'd think that if you wanted to store carbon on the land, the first thing you should do is go to those grasslands and plant it up with trees. But when we go and measure in these grasslands and in the forests, you often find that the places with the highest soil organic carbon, so this is the gray numbers below, it's ordered in terms of soil organic carbon, have very, very few trees. And in fact, if you did plant trees here, you would end up losing a lot of that soil organic carbon because it's being contributed by the grasses. So just to show that these places that look from the top, they look like they don't have a lot of biomass. When you look below ground, there's an immense amount of carbon that we need to measure, quantify, and conserve if we don't want to mess around with our global carbon budgets and our climate system. In fact, planting trees can sometimes actually release carbon, and we really need to be careful about that. And we have some good knowledge in South Africa, some amazing understanding of under what conditions planting trees is actually going to increase or decrease the soil carbon. So up till now, I've just been talking about the stocks. I've been talking about the boxes where that carbon is. But if we want to store carbon, if we want to look at the terrestrial land surface as a place where we could sequester carbon and help reduce and mitigate climate change, then we need to be looking at the arrows. And it basically means making these arrows into the land bigger, so bigger production of plants, or it means making the arrows out of the land smaller, so less loss of that soil organic carbon up into the sky again. So those are where we start to try to manipulate the terrestrial carbon budget. We have to remember that we have to think about our ecosystems in terms of what's natural. And we have to realize that in our ecosystems, which are often savannas, which have elephants and fires, there's a lot of natural fluctuation. We totally expect a savanna ecosystem to bounce around in terms of its above ground biomass from up to like 20 tons per hectare down to about 5. And we don't worry about that as biologists. That sort of variation is totally acceptable. Similarly, in the fynbos that gets repeat fires every 20 to 30 years, we expect accumulation of above ground biomass and then loss. And that's not considered degradation. It's healthy function of ecosystems. So when we think about those natural fluctuations, and then we start to look at maps of long-term trends of above ground carbon in Southern Africa, it's important to realize that when we see increased NDVI here, so increased above ground carbon, that doesn't necessarily mean that we've got healthy ecosystems there. Often these green patches here are places that we consider degraded with too many trees, not enough grass, not enough grazing resources. So we have to think about the long-term trends, both in terms of carbon and also in terms of what makes a healthy ecosystem. But if we try to think about the fluxes and what's happening, how much is going in and how much is going out of the land surface, this is a budget for the whole of Africa. And I'm going to talk you through this slowly because it's a bit tricky to get on top of, but then it really helps you understand these fluxes. So any of these arrows going up are fluxes out of the land surface. And these dashed lines here are our certainty about these fluxes. So you can see we've got a lot of uncertainty about many of our fluxes. So fossil fuels go up into the atmosphere, charcoal and fuel wood burning goes up into the atmosphere. Land use change drives a lot. When you plow up your soils to create croplands, all that soil carbon goes up to the sky. Livestock can emit methane, aquatic systems emit. And then this green arrow, which is going in, that's our terrestrial land surface taking up that carbon again. And you can see we know that the land surface is taking up carbon, but there's big errors around it. So at the scale of Africa, we're not climate neutral. We're an overall net flux of greenhouse gases, but it's pretty variable from decade to decade. In the last decade, our terrestrial flux in was twice as big as it was in the first decade of this century. And that's partly a mixture of like better rainfall, increased CO2 fertilization, perhaps some better land management processes. So there's a lot of variation from year to year with the terrestrial land surface. But the rest of Africa is quite different from South Africa. South Africa did all of this land use change back in the last century. We are not currently expanding the area under cultivation. So if you do the budget for South Africa, which people have done, this is a publication from 2024, you can see we've got our fossil fuel emissions for electricity, we have road transport, we have all sorts of processes emitting the CO2. And then we have the small flux in that we estimate to be about 43 teragrams or megatons of CO2. So it's very clear that the amount the land surface is currently taking up is quite small compared with the amount that we're emitting. But ultimately, all of these discussions about nature-based solutions and using the terrestrial land surface to help mitigate climate change are about trying to make this box bigger. So how could we do this? I just wanted to, again, give you the scale of Africa and to show you carbon's gains and losses in Africa. There's a lot of parts of Africa where there's a lot of net flux of carbon into the soil. So this is carbon storage happening all in the tropical forests. And there's lots of places where agriculture and land transformation is pouring carbon out of the soil. But South Africa is not a big player here. All of our carbon losses from land use change occurred a long time ago. And we don't have a large capacity for carbon loss or carbon gain because we're quite an arid country. And a lot of our land surface is actually quite arid systems that do not suck up carbon very quickly. Just to talk a little bit about the temporal context, this is some data from the Global Carbon Project showing when South Africa lost their land carbon. So it dated back to 1900s. As we started to use our land, transform, plant agriculture, we lost a lot of the soil organic carbon that used to be, but it was back in the 1940s to 1960s. From about the 1980s onwards, we've stabilized those losses. So we are no longer pouring carbon out of the land surface. We're actually taking up a little bit every year, but we've not yet got back. We're still, you know, to use the wording from the previous speaker, we're still sort of net negative in terms of we've lost that carbon and we haven't stored it back yet. But that's because we were doing important things like feeding the people in South Africa. So this is the area of land transformation. So these losses of soil carbon are not things that it's easy to get back, because we can't take all of our croplands and restore them back to bounce us back, because we need to continue to feed our people into the next centuries. So what can we do to sequester carbon in the land surface, given that we also need to support and provide for the people of South Africa? So this is data from the National Carbon Assessment, which looks at all the activities we could do on the land in South Africa, how feasible they are, and how much we could reduce the atmospheric carbon dioxide. So how much we could reduce the emissions over time. And you can see they range from restoration, so that's building up the above and below ground biomass again, to interesting things like using the energy that's there to replace some of our fossil fuel emissions. Anaerobic biogas digesters, biochar is an interesting one. And this is all still under debate. We've starting to work a lot on how we can manage our grazing systems to store a bit more carbon. So it's an active area of research, but the numbers are quite small. If we just contextualize it, these are the total annual emissions of South Africa. It's like 400 to 500 teragrams of carbon. So every year, this is how much South Africa lets out. This is how much we've emitted over the last century because of land use change. Again, look at the error bar. We're not sure about these numbers, but we know that we lost a lot of carbon when we plowed up our land and started to use it to provide for people. And then this is our annual sink capacity, somewhere between 14 and 50 teragrams of carbon a year. So we need to be really honest about our ability to replace fossil fuel emissions, to sort of offset any of our fossil fuel emissions with changing what we do on the land surface. So we think we can store somewhere between 14 and 43 teragrams of carbon a year through better land management, but we need to contextualize that properly. The other thing to think about, and this is where my colleague Mthokozisi is going to build on these ideas, is that not all biocarbon is good carbon. Sometimes we don't actually want that carbon in the land surface. It's caused by alien invasive trees, it's caused by bush encroachment, plantation forestry, can replace natural biodiversity, it can reduce water, potentially it can even cause erosion, and can have bad climate implications in terms of heating up the planet. So we need to be thinking, we need to be balancing what's good for biodiversity and whether we're going to be trying to offset some of our fossil fuel emissions. I'm going to hand over now to Mthokozisi to kind of expand a little bit on that and expand on how you kind of engage in these carbon capture projects when you're in lands that are lived in and used by people. So I'll leave Mthokozisi to talk to that slide. I just want to sort of end this part of the talk with some few key insights. Most carbon is in the soil as soil organic carbon, which means that restoring grassland is as important as restoring forest. Land management can only compensate for a very small fraction of our national emissions. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, because there's lots of good reasons to manage our land. But just be aware that these mitigation interventions are complicated because they involve people and they involve their livelihoods. So we should be focusing on interventions with the most impact, the lowest uncertainty, and when there's the most agreement among all of the stakeholders that this is a good thing to do with our land. I hope I've saved enough time for Mthokozisi to take over. I'm going to hand over to you, Mthokozisi.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sally, for giving the introduction, some background to what I'm going to speak about. So I'll just try and summarize this very quickly because some of the previous speakers have spoken about some of the points which I would like to speak about. But basically, we have shown how much carbon that there is, or how much carbon can potentially be stored in South Africa. But then it is very difficult to do that because there are so many other things which happening in the country. Like Sally has mentioned, that there's a lot of development where population is growing. There's a lot of food that needs to be grown. There's so many other things that people or as humans that we need from the earth, that like carbon, yes, as important as it is to store carbon, it becomes a bit difficult to just focus solely on that without considering the human factor. So this slide over here just speaks about some of the potential trade-offs that you have to think about when focusing on carbon and carbon sequestration. And in this case, these ones mostly speak about biodiversity, but I also want to bring in the human element. I can move on to the next slide. Okay, yes. So these are some of this is just a summary of some of the things that we can do if we're talking about like a bad biocarbon and what good biocarbon is, and like how we can try and maintain the balance. So one of the most important things that we can look into is actually restoring the degraded land that people live on. And this in itself increases like the soil organic carbon and improves biodiversity. And these are things that humans are also able to rely on as well. So if there's improved biodiversity, people are able to use those resources again to be able to meet their development goals. And then also it improves like the hydrology as well, which is something that we need as a country, because more water means communities are able to still survive while still trying to achieve the climate change goals as well. Another thing that we can also look into, since we spoke about the increase in population and the increase in agriculture, especially in the grasslands, because that's the one biome that is very much affected by increased agriculture, is to introduce some sustainable agricultural practices where people are still able to use the land, but they're able to use it in a more sustainable manner, which will be able to still benefit them in terms of agriculture, but still be able to achieve the climate change goal. I can move on to this next slide. So this brings me into what I currently do. So I work on carbon projects and like what really goes into a carbon project. So carbon projects have been identified as a way to achieve some of these goals. We go and start projects in certain project areas where there's an issue, and we're trying to address some of these questions. So this is basically like a life cycle of what a carbon project is. I'll just try to run through this very quickly. I don't think I have that much time, but basically there is a planning stage, there's a development of the project, what goes on with the standards, and then like how those standards or how the credits are actually issued. So I'm not going to go into too much detail in terms of that, but like what I want to do is go through the key considerations at each stage of this assessment. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so what I wanted to speak about here in the feasibility assessment stage, the first thing that you really need to think about is the kind of landscape that you're working in. So depending on the type of project that you'd like to implement, you have to consider the landscape that you're working in. And then you also have to think about things such as land tenure, like who owns that land. Because one of the other important things in terms of carbon projects is that you want to be able to store this carbon for a very long time. And if you're not too sure about what's going to happen on that land in the next few years, it becomes a bit difficult to be able to, should I say, budget for it, as the word says, that you can't say that in the next 15 years that carbon is going to be stored there. So those are some of the other things that you really need to think about. And like another thing which I think is very important is community engagement. So engaging with the local stakeholders there and wherever you're going to be implementing this project, because those are the people who are going to be looking after this land. There's no point in bringing a project there and then the people who are supposed to help you look after that land don't buy into it. And that also is what makes it very difficult to be able to have this carbon budget. So as much as we may have those numbers, but then the community engagement really helps to make sure that like at least you can try and reach those numbers. And also there are many other standards to consider where you look at the co-benefits of storing carbon, but also looking at the benefits of what it means for the community as well as for biodiversity. So for example, there's no need to come, like some of the carbon projects that you probably hear about is where people come and plant monocultures. They come and plant like big plantations of trees, which are not really good for biodiversity in that area because they may suck up a lot of water. They may affect the other species that are found in that particular area. Yes, it's storing carbon, but then it's having a negative impact on all of that. You can move on to the next slide. You can just skip through everything here because I'm not going to speak about each and every one of those steps because I wanted to do that, but because of time, I don't have time. So you can skip on to the next slide that speaks about the risks and challenges. So the other thing that we really need to think about, like I've already mentioned, is the risks and challenges that are involved in these kind of carbon projects. So one of the biggest thing is permanence. Like what strategies are there to ensure that there's a long-term sequestration in that particular land that you're working on? So for example, like you may have a good carbon project, you have restored the landscape, but then you have things like fires and droughts or land use change. What management strategies do you have to be able to deal with the disasters, as well as like the plan, like land use changes are usually planned, but like things like disasters like fires and droughts are something that are unplanned. Like what can you do to be able to deal with those risks as well? And then the second thing is leakage. So how do you plan to deal with displaced emissions? So here I'm speaking in the carbon context, in a carbon project context, because you're usually working in like a certain space. But how do you deal with maybe those risks being, or you restore a certain piece of land, for example, but then what's stopping that destruction from happening in another piece of land neighboring that one? So those are some of the other things that we really need to think about. And then also the last thing that we really also need to think about is ecosystem variability. So some of the challenges that you face in the field, like understanding the ecosystem dynamics, because sometimes you sit there and you model everything on the computer, it all looks so great. But then when you go down to the ground, you realize that it may be a savanna, but maybe that particular savanna behaves differently from what other savannas behave as. Or there could be climate shift. And there's also other things that we need to think about, like model limitations. Like I know we like to think that our models are very great, but sometimes there are actually limitations to some of the things that the models can show. So those are some of the other things that also add to the uncertainty when we're looking at carbon projects. Please move on to the next slide. So basically here, just explained, it's just about finding the balance between the tree carbon, the biodiversity, and water. Next. But then we also have to think about humans as well as part of that particular equation. I'll move on to the next slide. So then, like, this is probably the last slide which I'll speak to, which speaks about like balancing the trade-offs for a just transition. So we have to make sure that as much as we're thinking about carbon and storing carbon, we have to think about designing these projects in such a way that we balance the carbon storage with the livelihoods of people, as well as the land use and all the other things that are associated with that. And also we have to provide context-specific approaches where we tailor whatever intervention is there to the ecosystem and the problem that we have at hand. Next slide. So yes, in conclusion, like Sally has already spoken about, most of the carbon that we have in South Africa is in soil organic carbon, and restoring grasslands is the most important thing as compared to forests, because forests are a very small fraction of the land use, the land percentage in South Africa. Land management is a very important thing, but it can only compensate for a small fraction of the national emissions. And then these interventions have to include people and their livelihoods, because those are the people who will be able to maintain all of that. And then we have to focus on the interventions with the most impact, because that will reduce the uncertainty, and then we'll have the most agreement. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Prof. Sally, and thank you, Mthokozisi, for your inputs. We now move on, colleagues, to the last set of presentations for today. Then we're going to come to Q&A after these presentations. We're now moving to the technology and CO2 removal inputs. What types of technologies? What are the applications of such technologies? Our speakers are Dr. Matt Kelly and Mr. Toby Lockwood. Dr. Kelly is at the Rocky Mountain Institute, where he's a manager with the Carbon Dioxide Removal Initiative. And that is a global NGO that's focusing on energy and climate. Mr. Lockwood is a Director of Technology and Markets for Carbon Capture for Clean Air Task Force in Europe. In this role, he leads his organization's analytical work to assess how carbon capture can help meet Europe's climate goals. Over to you, Matt.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Matlana, and thanks to the Presidential Climate Commission for the opportunity to present today. Like was mentioned, I'm going to be talking about carbon dioxide removal and focusing on the technological aspects of that of carbon dioxide removal. So to start out with, I want to focus on first saying what is carbon dioxide removal and what is it not. There's often some conflation and confusion of terms, so I want to spend a little bit of time outlining what exactly we're talking about. Carbon management is often a term used to describe both carbon dioxide removal and CCUS, which Toby's going to talk more about in just a minute. But to be very clear and specific about what we're talking about when we say carbon dioxide removal, we're talking about activities that remove CO2 from the atmosphere, reduce the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and not activities that capture CO2 from a point source and are used to reduce emissions. And if you'll notice at the bottom, the language that the IPCC uses to describe this technology or this set of activities are deliberate human activities that intentionally remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So that's what we're talking about today. The next point that I'd like to make is there are many ways to do carbon dioxide removal. Many of you may have heard of things like reforestation and afforestation, which Professor Archibald talked about, as well as soil carbon sequestration. Many of you may be familiar with direct air capture of CO2 and conventional CO2 storage in geologic reservoirs. There are also many other methods, some of which are more mature, like biomass energy with carbon capture and storage, as well as others that are earlier stage and are more emerging. So biomass burial, where you take living biomass and put it in an environment where it won't degrade, or bio-oil, where you process biomass at high temperature and turn it into a form that doesn't decompose, or things like growing and sinking algae in the ocean or adding minerals to the ocean that cause it to draw CO2 down from the atmosphere. So this is all to say that carbon dioxide removal is not just the major techniques that have been discussed primarily in the IPCC reports. It's a very diverse space with a lot of emerging technologies and pathways. And to dive a little bit more into the maturity of these approaches, things like living biomass, so capturing or preserving biomass in soils and in above ground biomass like trees is one of the more mature approaches. And then things like ocean alkalinity enhancement is one of the techniques that is at an earlier stage. And these generally progress from doing basic science and research and development and determining how to accurately measure the amount of CO2 that is being drawn down by these techniques, then to things like initial deployment, where it's important to set up the systems and infrastructure to get these technologies and methods more ready to scale more broadly, including things like permitting processes and understanding all of the impacts that these techniques will have on the environments in which they're placed. And then finally to commercial scaling, where these techniques can be used to draw down CO2 at a large scale. To recap very briefly the state of CDR deployment to date, it's far, far below what we think will be needed to meet climate targets. The amount of CDR done today is about 12 million tons per year. A very high fraction of that is in approaches using living biomass, so afforestation, reforestation, and soils. A much smaller fraction of that is in approaches like direct air capture that store CO2 securely underground, and in other emerging approaches. For reference, the entire voluntary carbon market, this VCM, is 180 million tons per year. And that's things that include activities like emissions reduction and clean energy and clean cook stoves, and things that are not CDR but are transacted carbon credits. And that's in comparison to the 5 to 10 gigatons that we are projected to need in 2050 to meet IPCC targets. Another complicating factor is that any single one of these approaches is very unlikely to be able to meet this full need. So this graph is adapted from a report that RMI recently did called the Applied Innovation Roadmap for CDR, showing that if many techniques are deployed to the maximum that they can be in a sustainable manner around the globe, we will need many, many techniques to be able to meet this target. So even though we do have techniques that will draw CO2 down from the atmosphere right now, it's important to deploy those immediately, but also develop these emerging approaches so that they are ready and available as we need them moving forward. So moving on from what is CDR and more to the why do we care, why is it needed? The net in net zero implies the use of CDR to counteract ongoing emissions. So there is very likely to be some ongoing emissions in the future, and any entity or country or the world having a net zero target implies that there is going to be some activity that doesn't just reduce or avoid emissions, it's going to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and oceans to reduce the atmospheric concentration of CO2. And many of you may have used the term residual emissions, and this ongoing emissions is intended to capture that term, which often refers to hard to abate emissions, and rather just talk about there are likely some emissions that are going to continue at the point of net zero and beyond it. And those ongoing emissions, whatever they are from whatever sources they come from, will need to be compensated by carbon dioxide removal in order to achieve net zero and potentially net negative if there is a need to draw down atmospheric CO2 concentrations to lower levels and address these historical emissions. And touching again on these hard to abate emissions in the context of South Africa and everywhere really, those emissions are likely to be relevant in a number of different sectors. So carbon dioxide removal could be used for emissions to counteract emissions that are technologically infeasible to abate. And there are really a lack of solutions in multiple sectors like livestock or agricultural soils, where the alternative options or where zero emissions alternatives are really not available. And there's not really line of sight to achieving those in the near or the far term. There are also emissions that are expensive to abate, especially now, and that may be less the case in the future if those technologies are deployed over time. And another thing that I'll note about achieving net zero is that in this context, it's important to compare not just the cost of alternative technologies that can reduce emissions, but if the target is net zero, the cases to compare are a full decarbonization solution. So for example, like using hydrogen in steelmaking versus using CCS that captures a portion of the emissions, plus carbon dioxide removal to clean up the emissions that still are emitted. And that's an important consideration to take into account when doing planning for how much CDR to use and how much and what sets of decarbonization solutions to use. Another rationale for carbon dioxide removal is not just the need for CDR, but the opportunity that CDR presents. And one of the ways that we think about this is that carbon dioxide removal, if we are to achieve the climate target goals, could be one of the largest industries in the world and move a huge amount of mass. There are few industries in the world that move material at this scale, so that would require an enormous workforce that presents a great opportunity for countries that deploy CDR, and especially as an opportunity for transitioning workers from industries that are being displaced by decarbonization activities. There's also a potential opportunity to export CDR to countries who need it to meet their climate goals, but cannot meet it given their own domestic resources. And there's an opportunity for countries to leverage industrial infrastructure that they already have in industries like wastewater desalination, mining, and waste remediation, using some of these emerging CDR methods that could be applicable to these industries. And to start to wrap up, one point that I'll leave you with is that when thinking about carbon dioxide removal as part of climate action, it's important to think about how much will be needed, when it will be needed, and what types can be used. So in the context of South Africa, what is the right time to start deploying CDR at a certain scale as the country tries to reach net zero by 2050, and what kinds of CDR are appropriate given South Africa's geography, natural resources, and social and political environment. One of the ways that other countries have done this and how RMI has been involved in assisting with this process is doing CDR readiness assessment reports and roadmaps for deployment. And the center image in this slide is an example of a readiness assessment that was done for the country of France that looked at things like resource requirements, existing resources, existing policies, the social environment, and then putting together a roadmap of actions that can be taken by national stakeholders to achieve the country's goals. And finally, I'll leave you with a few points that I hope you remember from this discussion. CDR is needed alongside emissions reduction, and it's distinct from emissions reductions. There are many types of CDR, many of which are early stage, but we will need more types of CDR than we currently have ready and deployable. CDR will be necessary to meet net zero goals to counteract ongoing emissions, and it's important to plan for how countries will use CDR to meet their goals. I'll wrap up just with a very brief note on RMI. We are a global nonprofit focused on climate and energy. We have a large CDR dedicated team and an even larger set of folks who do carbon dioxide removal and carbon markets related work. We do things like assessments of technologies, including our recent applied innovation roadmap on research and development priorities, and assist with roadmaps that can be used by countries and companies to plan for the use of CDR. So if you have any questions or see any opportunities where we can help or work together, please reach out.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. Toby, are you ready to come and start your presentation?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
That's great. I'll just turn on my video. Oh, that's too bad. My camera's not working. Hopefully, that won't be needed. I'm just going to share my slides. Sorry, I'm being a little bit slow here. Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Is it full screen?
Not yet.
They're looking better?
Yet, at least on my side, not yet.
All good. Thank you very much for the introduction. Apologies, my camera's not working, but really good to be here. And I hope everyone's still with us after this a long series of presentations. And I hope I can wrap things up here or contribute the last presentation of the day. I think a little introduction to Clean Air Task Force. We're also a non-profit climate NGO, originally founded in the US, but now working globally, including in Africa. I'm based in the UK. I work on the EU and UK policy, and we cover a wide range of vital technologies which we think need to be scaled up to achieve global climate goals and avoid the worst effects of global warming. So what I'm going to be talking about today is carbon capture and storage, which is my focus. We also work on enhancing the land sink, which we've heard a lot about today, reducing methane pollution and many other technologies. So we've had a little bit of an intro to this from Matt already, but just to explain what carbon capture, utilization, storage is, well, it's a solution for eliminating CO2 from processes that emit fossil CO2. You can really use the same technologies to capture and store biogenic or atmospheric CO2, which we've heard Matt talk about. And while these things are considered, they have distinct climate functions. Really, the technologies can be very similar in many cases. So first, there's a capture step in which you have to separate CO2, make quite pure CO2, often around 98, 99% stream of CO2, and usually you have to transport that CO2 to somewhere it can be stored, and that can be by pipeline or also in a ship or a train or even a truck. Those are all ways in which CO2 is moved around today. In fact, that's not a new technology. And finally, it can be stored geologically, so deep underground, over a kilometer below the ground, which I'm going to talk about a bit, or it can be chemically converted to products. And there's really, I'm not going to talk too much about utilization today, but it's worth bearing in mind there's a big range of difference. There's a lot of difference in the climate impact between turning CO2 to a fuel when it's recombusted and re-emitted, and to something like cement where it would be bound as a solid mineral carbonate and not re-released. But there's lots of options available there. I'm just going to check my time because I don't have a clock on screen here. I'll try and speed up a bit because I think we're a bit behind time. So the key technology in CCS and also for some of the CDR technologies that Matt talks about is geological CO2 storage. So as you can see in these images, this is really about finding a suitable place. You can't just store CO2 underground anywhere. You need to find somewhere which normally a sedimentary basin which has porous sedimentary rocks like sandstone, and also a denser cap rock layer above that porous rock, like a shale. And as you can see in the kind of zoomed in figures on the left, the CO2 is injected through a well, kind of reverse of oil and gas extraction, and then it is sort of structurally trapped in the porous rock, and it's buoyant and it wants to rise, but it's blocked by this cap rock layer. And over time, the CO2 becomes more stable. In fact, it dissolves in often salty water, brine, which is found in the reservoir, and can eventually turn to mineral carbonates, which are solid. So why do we need CCS? Two analyses shown here, the IEA's World Energy Outlook, which shows the scale up of CCS, and the dark blue layer there is kind of CDR delivered by geological storage, so kind of related types of CDR. But we're looking at nearly 6 billion tons of CO2 stored by 2050 under a net zero by 2050 scenario. Also interesting to look at the IPCC's 6th assessment report, which came out a couple of years ago now. It's some interesting analysis that looks at the carbon flows in the 1.5 degree compatible scenarios, which there are many in that report. But you can see that, and this relates a bit to what we heard about this earlier today, the flux, the kind of net flux out of the atmosphere that you can get from land use change. This is the green line, is quite limited, and all the scenarios rely quite heavily on the blue line, which is geological storage of CO2, and that includes atmospheric CO2 and fossil CO2. But what this graph is trying to show is that really to stop global warming, we need not just to have a net flux from the atmosphere into the land, but we need to have a state of geological net zero. So you can see that the black line, which shows the red line minus the blue line, essentially, it's the fossil emissions minus what we're storing geologically. So I'm going to talk about what's happening on the ground now. It really depends a bit how you count, but there's around 50 commercial projects that are capturing, storing CO2 today, and there's similar now under construction. Now, most of these projects, we hear about them a lot. A lot of them weren't really designed for climate purposes. They're actually kind of opportunistic situations where there's quite pure CO2 already present from some processes produce quite pure CO2, like ammonia production, for instance, coal gasification, natural gas processing, and then often there's a business case to take that CO2 and put it underground to enhance oil production. And so that is capturing and storing CO2, but it's really, a commercial activity related to oil production. The CO2 does stay down there. It is storing the CO2. It's just also producing oil. A lot of that's happening in North America, but now increasingly in other countries as well. And you can get an idea of this from this map from the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, which shows, yeah, there's activity not just in North America, but increasingly in Northern Europe, in the Middle East. There's a very large project going on in Brazil, and increasingly in China and Southeast Asia now as well. So that's what's happening in CCS today, but there's kind of a new wave of CCS development, which is based around targeting specific sectors, in particular these hard to abate industrial processes that Matt mentioned. So things like cement and lime, where there's a lot of emissions which aren't even related to fossil fuel combustion. You can't get rid of these by using green electricity or green hydrogen. They come from the CO2 in the limestones. That's a key sector for CCS, and also a really huge contributor to global CO2 emissions. Steel has some other options available, could potentially use green hydrogen, but it's, you know, all the routes are challenging, and CCS is definitely on the table for steel, another big contributor. Also, waste incineration is an important target in Europe, especially. So there's really growing political interest, especially in the last 2 or 3 years worldwide in CCS. I'm just going to highlight a few. There's, you know, lots to talk about here. CATF works primarily on this in the US and Europe. I'm going to highlight some things that are happening. The US Inflation Reduction Act raised an existing tax credit for storing CO2 to $85 per ton in certain circumstances. So that's a really major incentive, which has kicked off a lot of activity there. Also, direct funding through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The EU this year put forward 2 really pivotal pieces of legislation, an industrial carbon management strategy, and introduce an obligation on oil and gas producers in the bloc to develop CO2 storage capacity. There's also a lot of direct funding to new projects going on. Not just activity in these advanced economies, you know, middle income economies, also taking steps forward. China has some national funding towards large CCS projects, and there's a lot of activity happening without funding. In fact, some large projects now under construction in coal power, coal to chemicals, steel and cement. And Saudi Arabia has very large storage potential. It's often linked to oil and gas production. The storage potential they're developing is not linked to oil and gas production, but you often get similar types of rocks in areas which are big oil and gas producers. So they have big potential to store, and lots of emissions related to the oil and gas industry. So they're looking to scale up very rapidly around their Jubail industrial hub. So I'm trying to go a bit faster because I think we're kind of out of time. I thought I'd flag this international initiative called the Carbon Management Challenge, which was kicked off at the COP before the last one, COP last year, which is essentially countries sign up and commit to helping towards a global effort to reach 1 billion tons of CO2 stored per year by 2030, which aligns with the IEA scenario I showed earlier. And yeah, interesting to know Mozambique has signed up to that as well as Kenya. So the new wave of CCS projects we're seeing a little bit different from some of those enhanced oil recovery projects I noted before. These ones are often targeting basically higher climate benefits, so often very high rates of CO2 captured, at least 95% is often targeted. There's a shift away from enhanced oil recovery and storing really in dedicated storage sites, which are often associated with saline aquifer formations or completely depleted oil and gas reservoirs. And it's worth noting that we have CO2 capture technologies that are proven at large scales today, and those are being, you know, rolled out at the scale of 1 million tons per year capture capacity or greater. But there's potential to improve on those existing technologies in terms of cost or environmental impact. So there's still a lot of technologies being developed, basically better ways of separating CO2 from other gases. There's many ways you could do that, which I won't go into today. The key thing really is the bottom line. How much does CCS cost? Here are some cost estimates from the International Energy Agency. You can see that it really depends a lot on what exhaust stream you're targeting. Some are very pure. You can see gas processing, biofuels, ammonia, quite low capture costs, $20 to $40 per ton, but that can go much higher for a sector, something like cement, where CO2 is more dilute, or a refinery process like a cracker. Can go above $100 per ton, and the cost of transporting and storing CO2 can also be hugely variable in the EU at the moment. We have sometimes prices around $100 per ton are being talked about because they're quite small scale, early value chains, often involving shipping and higher cost solutions compared to pipelines. So that equates to really an increase in the cost of your production, something like cement or power, by 50 to 100%, so as much as a doubling. But to put that in perspective a bit, a study from a couple of years ago by Norwegian Research Institute highlighted that even if you have quite a high increase in the cost of your raw materials, that can equate to a relatively small increase, even around 1%. In the cost of your final product, something like a bridge, which is using those from raw materials, the final cost can go up just by 1 or 2%. So the overall cost of society is not necessarily so impactful. I wanted to say a little bit about CCS in the power sector. Coal power used to be, I would say, the primary focus for CCS, for carbon capture and storage, when I first started working in this field about 15 years ago. As I've outlined, that's no longer the big focus. People looking more at hard to abate industries, but it's clearly a sector of interest for South Africa. So I thought I would put up some research on the right here from the US Department of Energy, which shows cost estimates for how much the cost of power, the levelized cost of electricity, would increase for a coal power plant. You can see it goes from around $64 per megawatt hour without capture to over 100. With that said, we've looked at, when you look at holistically at decarbonizing a whole grid, and we've done this ourselves for the Polish power grid, which is also quite coal dependent. On the left here, you can see coal as the kind of dark gray bar. If you force the grid to decarbonize by 2050, coal does phase out, but you do see CCS on gas power to some extent, where it plays a supporting role to, what is primarily a grid made up of renewables. In this case, it's largely onshore wind. And for that reason, there are countries in Europe and elsewhere looking at CCS on gas power, and the UK is one, and we're expecting a final investment decision on a gas power plant with CCS very shortly. So I'm going to wrap up. I hope I haven't gone too much over time. The message really is that the science is clear that reaching our climate goals will need, we can't say exactly how much, but on the order of billions of tons of CO2 to be permanently stored geologically every year. Carbon capture and storage is most needed for decarbonizing these hard to abate industrial processes, such as cement and steel. These are typified by high process temperatures and inherent CO2 or process CO2, which really comes from the chemistry of the process. So really fundamentally driven by net zero targets, where kind of every emission needs to be looked at. CCS policies and projects are developing all over the world. But CCS does incur, it's not a quick fix, it does incur a significant cost penalty, and it's particularly challenging for emissions intensive developing economies, such as India. But all that said, the cost impact on end products can be relatively small. So the conclusion is that we need to think about CCS, but also how to deploy it strategically alongside other technologies where appropriate, and with the overall aim of lowering the overall cost to society of decarbonisation. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Toby. Trying to put on my camera. Yeah. Colleagues, we've come to the end of the presentations. You'll recall that we started with Prof. Monteiro, who helped us understand what exactly we're talking about when we talk about carbon budgets. Then we had Professor Joeri, who gave us a case study focusing on how to determine fairness and ambition. Prof. Sally and Mthokozisi talked about terrestrial carbon budgets, terrestrial carbon fluxes. And then we've just listened to Dr. Kelly and Toby describing available and emerging technologies and applications. So I open the floor then to your questions and comments to these speakers that we've had. How do I see the hands again? 3 hands, it says. I'm not able to see where they are. Now there are 4. Let me go there. I'm trying to find the hands. Just give me one moment to get to the right screen. Okay, we've got Gillian, we've got Ryan, we've got Michael and James. Let's go in that order. Gillian and then Ryan. Gillian, please. Can you hear me, Gillian? Okay. Let's try Ryan and see if Ryan can come in. Ryan K. Can you unmute Ryan? All right, that's not working either. Let's try James. James, can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Brian. And
Please
hello,
go.
everybody. So I think the carbon budget question is always it's a very contentious one, but it's very pertinent. But there is also obviously always a risk of exceeding the budget if we make invalid assumptions about the netting potential, so around the CCS. So I did have a question in the Q&A, but about from the panelists who have some experience in this area about how much realistically you feel you could scale carbon capture and storage by 2050 in the South African context. So kind of the question is, what is the lead time? What are the infrastructural needs? We had some comment on the costs. And also knowing that a lot of the carbon dioxide storage at the moment is enhanced oil recovery, which obviously is not an option for South Africa because we don't have those resources there. So it would have to be in, there isn't the sort of underlying infrastructure in the first place for the storage. Because it's pertinent for our carbon budget. So I'd be interested either of any of the panelists who feel they have a grasp on that, about how much we could scale in the next 25 years.
I can perhaps come in on that. I mean, I'm not, it's been a while since I've, many years since I've worked in South Africa, but yeah, and many people in this webinar perhaps know better than me the current status of CO2 storage development. But there is, of course, a CO2 storage pilot being developed, which I understand is set to kick off next year. Yeah, it's a good place to start. It does take time to scale these things up. I don't think you need oil production potential. South Africa has sedimentary basins which are suitable for storage, and that's really where it's these saline aquifers which are being primarily exploited now the world over, in Europe as well. That's where the big capacity is for storage, and so you don't need. That's not necessarily tied to oil production, or they are often found in similar basins to where oil production occurs. So there is potential there to maybe an important step to thoroughly characterize that capacity and determine what the storage capacity is, and then perhaps determine how that can be best used by emitting parts of the economy. But there's clearly some low-hanging fruit in terms of capture in South Africa, particularly around the coal to liquids industry.
Yeah, thanks, Toby. I mean, I guess the question was, if you assumed that we were able to sequester kind of unlimited, it's more about pipeline and scaling. Like, given that we have this period and we don't have, the EOR thing means that you already have injection infrastructure. We don't have that. So scaling from 0 to where can you get to in 25 years? The global removal potential is roughly, it's somewhat less than the whole globe's removal at the moment is less than Sasol's emissions. So the total amount of CCS in the world at the moment wouldn't be able to do that one installation. So the question is, in the next 25 years, do you see us getting to the same level as the globe did in the last 25 years, or less or more?
I think there's some interesting studies you can look at in terms of, typical scale-up rates for historically for both pipelines and drilling wells. And you can look at analogs from it. There's not really adequate analog in the carbon storage industry, but you can look at analogs in oil and gas production to show what's possible in terms of infrastructure development. Of course, it's harder for a country which doesn't have the kind of historical expertise and supply chains. But I mean, everyone's got ambitious targets in this sense. Europe has targeted. Europe also doesn't have a history of enhanced oil production, and it has targeted 50 million tons of CO2 storage per year by 2030. Even that's in no time at all. So I think a number like that is achievable even in South Africa over a longer time scale. And yes, of course, it won't can't be the only option for a huge emitter like Sasol. We need to reduce, tackle the problem from multiple sides.
No, thanks, Toby. I don't see another hand. Any other question for the speakers? Also, I've noticed that the speakers have been responding to some of the questions that have been posed in the chat. So others may want to go and read what is happening in the chat section. Can I invite you, Joeri, to come in and talk about the response that you've given in the answer on the chat, please?
Yeah, sure. I also just noticed that 2 other hands went up. So
okay.
To speak or let the others speak as well with new questions.
No, let's let the others. Let's listen to what let's listen to Desigan first. Desigan, please come in.
Thank you, Brian. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Yep. Okay, great. My question is this: given that we have 90% of the carbon soil bound currently, how do we balance this out against South Africa's own ambition to get more and more land under crops in particular as part of our agricultural strategy? And given that tilling is one of the dominant activities associated with modern agriculture, isn't this putting us at enormous risk around our current sequestration capacity? Thank you.
I think that's for Sally. Sally, you want to come in and respond to that?
So I'm struggling to juggle the Q&A questions and the
So
audio.
you sound very far, Sally.
Sorry, could you repeat the questions? I'm struggling to juggle the Q&A and the audio at the same time. So if you don't mind.
Okay,
Sorry.
Desigan, please come back. Desigan, please come back.
Sure, I'm happy to, and I'll summarize. 90% of the carbon currently trapped in the soil. And I just want to know about what that means for our risk, given that the development plan is quite keen to put several hundreds of thousands of hectares under crop and also development.
Great. Yes. So I think the problem with Africa, and there's been a paper published on this that I can share with you, is that the Department of Agriculture has plans for expanding agriculture. And then you have often a different department that is committing to store carbon at massive, like set aside hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of land for storing carbon, and the two don't align. So sometimes the commitment for expanded agriculture, and if you add the protected land for carbon, it ends up with a larger area than the size of the country. So there are some serious inconsistencies in terms of what we're planning in terms of development and becoming the breadbasket of the world, and what we're committing in terms of helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For South Africa, I think there's a lot of potential with our agricultural land to do agriculture in a less carbon emitting way. So uptake of this no tillage agriculture hasn't been very extensive in South Africa yet, even though there's some great data showing that you can achieve as good production and sometimes better production with no-till agriculture that keeps the carbon in the soil. So I think we do have wriggle room in South Africa, but we need to get the Department of Agriculture talking to the Department of the Environment as soon as possible. Does that answer your question, Des?
Yes, again, is silent, Prof. Archibald.
I don't know if I'm still muted, but there's a conversation we need to get into, because the PCC is currently developing out an agriculture paper, and I think this could be a very important part of it. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you. The PCC can mention it, but we are trying to develop more integrated modeling and planning skills, and the PCC is helping to drive that, so they can speak to that.
Thanks, Prof. Any further questions? Let's check the hands again. Guy, please come in, Prof. Mitchell.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
It's a kind of a related question to Des's question. The terrestrial and the ocean carbon sinks are by far the biggest game in town. 3 billion tons of carbon per year on average, depending on the weather for terrestrial, obviously. But the way we manage ecosystems is obviously going to be critical in managing this huge sink globally. And in our part of the world, with bush encroachments roaring across landscapes and changing the structure of landscapes, changing biodiversity, changing land use, that is an almost unending supply of wood that we just have no strategy about. We're losing biodiversity because of bush encroachments. It is a potential source of energy. It's a potential source of all sorts of products. We've got no strategy, and it links, I think, to Desigan's question about how we're going to manage these natural sinks and these natural systems better. I don't know if Sally wants to comment or Pedro comment about it, but for me, it's a huge gap, and we don't have the understanding about what to do.
I can certainly comment on the land surface side, Guy. Yeah, I should have made that more clear. That 43 telegrams that we think we're storing every year in South Africa, largely that's because we've got massive increases in bush encroachment. Like I showed you, the overall trends are greening trends for South Africa, but that's not necessarily what we want as a country. Like Mtho showed you that, there's people on the ground using that land, and the trees might not be what they want. But we're really starting to realize that we could use that wood as a product. We can capture it, we can turn it into biochar and put it in the ground. That is a very effective, stable way to store carbon. And we have got that biochar pathway in our estimates. At the moment, it's about 5% of the current terrestrial sequestration potential. But I think the technology to do this biochar projects at the scale we need to is increasing. So that potentially could increase. So we need to think creatively about, we need to move away from thinking, let's just be happy that we've got some trees on the land that are storing a little bit of carbon, and start to think about how to use those trees to reinvigorate our landscapes and really sequester that carbon somewhere where it's not going to be lost in the next wildfire.
What about a working for biochar program, like working for water?
Totally. And in terms of scaling, there's been discussions here about scaling. I think there's quite a lot of people asking the capacity to do that. There's a lot of room to scale these biochar projects, but we need the engineers because, biochar, You can do it badly and send most of it, the carbon back up to the atmosphere, or you can do it more efficiently, but that requires a certain scale of operation. So there's a lot of room to look there. But Guy, we also need to be honest that our land surface is never going to suck up the amount of carbon we're still trying to claw back the carbon we lost when we did all that agriculture last century. We mustn't pretend to people that our land surface is going to replace the fossil fuels that we're emitting. It's just not true.
No, I don't think that's the case. But I mean, you can also torrefy the wood and replace carbon. You can replace coal. I mean, the Namibians could do that as well. I think I just don't think we've thought it. We don't have a strategy.
That is there. We've got 15% of that terrestrial is using our biomass for energy and replacing coal. It is there. The numbers might not be correct. So it's not that we haven't thought about it. It's been considered. It's part of the strategy. It's there as a pathway. We've tried to guesstimate the numbers.
But like a working for program might really energize something like this.
Right. So scaling it up and getting the energy from government and from funders to see how big it could scale. You know, we're being quite conservative about what's possible. Potentially there's more capacity, but you know, even if you double what we're able to do now, we're not going to allow, it's not going to replace the kind of fossil fuel emissions that we're doing.
But it can save biodiversity.
Thanks.
Definitely.
Thanks, Guy.
There's lots of other good reasons to do it.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks, Sally. I want to invite Gray McGuire.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, thanks for the comments, Guy and Sally. Just to comment on that, though, Guy, specifically on the biochar angle. So the greenhouse did do a biochar feasibility assessment for Department of Environment back in 2015. So there's a good body of work that is existent upon this. But I'd just like to encourage additionally on that, you know, is alignment with broader strategic goals as well. So I know that you mentioned about the biodiversity angle, and that's all very well and fine. But the reality is, you know, and Guy, I know that you're all too familiar with this, but when we did the maths during the whole day zero crisis in the Western Cape, we established the fastest and cheapest way to be able to free up additional liters of water and maximize buck spend for that was to get the aliens out of our catchment management zones. And we know that we've got 8 major strategic water catchment zones within the country, and they are heavily, heavily encroached. So, you know, being able to try and align, and obviously, you know, we're sitting here, we're busy staring down the barrel of our new day zero in the Gauteng region, which obviously there needs to be initial investments in terms of being able to do something around the rates of leakages. But fundamentally, if we intend to be able to secure their long-term water productive capacity, we need to be able to improve the rates of just overall environmental integrity within the catchment zones. And that applies for Port Elizabeth as well, particularly in the Baviaanskloof, the Krom Rivier and the Krom and the Koga. So I would just really encourage that. But the other thing that I think is just a point of concern is that when I look across the major companies that could be engaged in terms of the production of large-scale pyrolysis and retort level facilities in the country. I mean, I've been very involved in the alien biomass beneficiation component, particularly in the Western Cape, but have been looking outside of the Western Cape for a number of years. I look at these big companies, you know, like the Toronto Group and Criterion Africa and those kinds of guys. They're just not getting it done. You know, the IDC went through and put together 120 million rand to fund that, the one facility outside of Worcester. That hasn't happened. I know Criterion has developed the largest facility in the SADC region in Namibia. You know, like we're just not getting it done domestically. So I think that something particularly supported by the IDC would be, or the DBSA would be extremely advantageous in terms of being able to address that particular problem. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. I see your hand is up. Guy, do you want to come back?
I just wanted to quickly come back and say, yeah, I think it's a kind of joined up thinking we're going to need. Looking at the biodiversity angles, looking at the water savings angles. I know you go and look at the foothills of the Drakensberg. There's a lot of bush encroachment now starting to creep up those foothills, and it's affecting people's livelihoods. It's affecting grazing land. It is affecting the water towers of South Africa. You know, I think this is a very real risk, and tackling it just as a unique problem is not ideal. I think we've got to see it in the bigger context of a national sort of land use plan, and get it right. Otherwise, we could make some big mistakes, I think.
All right. Thanks, Guy, and again, thanks, Sally, for the exchange. I do not see any other hands. Any other questions or comments to the speakers? Just again, is that a new hand?
If you'll give me 30 seconds.
Yes, please.
Okay. I would want to ask Joeri this question. I did put it in the Q&A, but maybe we give him a chance to verbalize it. I mean, given where the EU is sitting currently politically, and this shift to the right, and given its responses to the energy crisis generated by the Ukraine war in particular, but there's more coming up, I think. What really does the outlook really look like for the carbon ambition of the EU? Will it be able to hold the previous line, or are we looking at a very difficult scenario? Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to take this question. Of course, not necessarily part of the webinar here. So just to be sure, the advice that I provided was the advice as published and therefore submitted and communicated to the European Commission. European Commission has subsequently made a proposal themselves for a proposed target of 90%. So that is the within the range that we have advised. That is now in a process. Still, we just have a new commission, so European Commission being put in place. So early next year, they will go through kind of all the machinations of deciding on the actual targets. So now we have a commission proposal for 90%. What is the likelihood of this happening? At least the noises and the messages that I am hearing is that there is a strong commitment to this. Actually, the Ukraine crisis has also shown the clear benefit of being independent from Russian imports, particularly gas in that case. And therefore, it really shows that transforming to a decarbonized system provides multiple benefits, not just less carbon, but also, if it's done in a good way, energy security and energy independence. And so that is definitely also something that is front and center of the considerations of policymakers, even despite the move to the right. So I think that is there in terms of intentions. At the same time, both the European Scientific Advisory Board and the European Environmental Agency, we do regular checks of how the EU is tracking towards achieving their current goals, which is at least 55% reduction by 2030. And my understanding is that currently the policies that are available still fall slightly short of achieving that 55% reduction by 2030, but by a few percentage points. But I don't know whether that takes into account the latest updates to the policies. So this could well have further reduced in the meantime. So yeah, there is definitely more work to be done, but at least in terms of intention, I think there is a clear path forward still.
Thanks, Prof. In your presentation, there's an aspect that drew my attention, which was part of your value judgment criteria, set of, I call it a criteria. It was the equality principle. Can you talk a little bit more about the equality principle?
Yeah, the equality principle is often in the easiest ways possible. Every individual is equal, or every person on this planet is equal, which is in the simplest of ways one interpretation that can be given to considerations of equity and fairness. It is immediately you can tell or you can understand that it is a not fully adequate interpretation of equity and fairness, because obviously while human rights might be universal, it is clear that there are populations that are in better socioeconomic conditions than others, and therefore not everybody starts from an equal position. Not everybody has an equal responsibility for the climate change that has happened. Not everybody has equal opportunities. And so while equality is kind of a very simple, basic starting point to think maybe about equity, it is also acknowledged that this needs to be extended with concept of responsibility, capability, sustainable development, and so on.
Thanks, Prof. Any further comments or questions? I went to the Q&A and there's a question that says, are there any references for CCS with natural gas fired power plants? Matt or Toby?
Yeah, I could say that. So I didn't see that in the Q&A. The largest there's been to date was at a power plant called Bellingham in the US, which only operated for a short period and no longer is. So really the main and that was capturing CO2 really to use in the food and beverage industry, which is a big buyer of pure CO2. So that was quite a small scale. I think about equivalent of like a 30 megawatt size gas power plant. There's a similar size, a little bit smaller plant as part of a research site in Norway, but really the main references we can point to are emerging plans. So as I mentioned in my talk, there's a plan in the UK which has funding now and is likely to take a final investment decision in the coming weeks. And I think there's a few in the US, the one in California, which is quite close to going ahead. And those are very large scale utility gas power plants. So quite a big step up, but very similar process to some of the larger scale demonstrations we've seen in places like coal power. So, and in some cases easier because the CO2 is cleaner. So, yeah, there's confidence from the technology providers.
No, thanks, Toby. Colleagues, I request that we leave it here for today. And thank you for the fascinating interaction towards the end after the presentations. I want to hand over to Eugen, who's going to close the session now. Eugen?
Thanks, Brian. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm going to try and summarize very briefly a bit of what was said today, and then just close. I think it's fair to say global and terrestrial carbon sinks are clearly very complex systems that require a deep scientific understanding, regular updates, and robust planning to manage, especially as remaining global budgets shrink and the urgency for action increases. As we heard today, the current global efforts by countries to limit warming to 1.5 degrees are also insufficient. Top emitters will need to work effectively with other countries to align this responsibility with ambition. CO2 removal technologies currently offer promise for hard to abate sectors and will certainly become increasingly important, although their adoption is currently competing with other solutions where these exist. This will be an important area to watch as the world decarbonizes. As we also saw, South Africa's emissions cannot rely solely on land-based fluxes or sequestration, although this too needs to be carefully researched and planned, reinforcing where we find ourselves currently, in need of reducing sectoral emissions in less hard-to-abate sectors. So today's discussion has certainly highlighted the urgency of actions to prevent exceeding global limits and preserve remaining global carbon budgets. As South Africa currently is reviewing its nationally determined contributions and aims to scale up its climate ambition, it is clear that collaboration, innovation, and good, should I add, integrated planning, will be essential. For the PCC, we believe it's vitally important to bring all views into this conversation: government, labor, business, civil society, and youth, but really everyone in South Africa, to ensure an inclusive and just transition that strengthens resilience and global competitiveness. The session has been recorded and will be uploaded to our website, particularly for those of us like me that need to listen more deeply or a few more times to some of the presentations. So in closing, a heartfelt thanks to all of our speakers for sharing their expertise. We really value your time and inputs, and to all our participants for your thoughtful questions and active engagement. We invite you to engage with us further about questions we didn't get to today. Your contributions are invaluable to shaping South Africa's journey towards a just and resilient transition. We look forward to continuing this dialogue. As I've said, we'd like to invite you to engage with us or contact us if you have any remaining questions. Thank you very much. And I think that closes the session.
Thank you.